Thank you very much, Dr. Byrne, for joining the Judaism Demystified podcast. I heard your podcast, I heard your speech somewhere online a little while ago, and it blew me away. And I just said, this is the kind of story that needs to be heard, especially in a time like today where there's a rising anti-Semitism and Nazism. For those who are just listening to the doctor for the first time, this is an amazing person who was a child of a highly decorated, high-ranking Nazi, and he completely changed his destiny. And I'm not going to tell you any more. Without further ado, I'd love for the doctor to tell you his life story.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, man. Whenever I'm talking either online or live or in every form of a context, I have to take a deep breath and ask myself, why on earth do I spill my beans, so to say, my life in front of people that I don't know? Many of you appear to be nice persons, but imagine I'm telling you and telling others my life, the intimate details of my life, how it happened and where I'm right now. For me, of course, history starts at the time and the place where I'm born in and born at. And I was born in Bamberg on 9th of May, 1958, 13 years and 1 day after the capitulation of Germany, and grew up in a beautiful town that is kind of fairy tale. And I'm putting it in the front because when my son Tal asked me a simple question regarding the place where I was born, I didn't know how to answer it. I didn't know how to answer him at all. He asked me a simple question, Abba mi Saba sheli, father, who is my grandfather? And you would say that's very simple to answer. You have a grandfather and a grandmother. Well, it was not that simple for me. Because on the one hand, my son went to Jewish schools like all my children, therefore I cannot ever give up working, pay back the debts. I'm just kidding. He fit in the morning, going to synagogue. So a nice Jewish boy. And on the other hand, his father, yours truly, who was a Jew and Israeli and served as a soldier in a combat unit in the Israeli army. And with the shadow of my father looming over me, who was a National Socialist, a Nazi, and a Jew hater par excellence. So how can I reconcile both worlds, the Jewish life and this darkness that I didn't want to touch with a 6-foot pole? It was like a dark energy, dark matter. I didn't want to go there. So therefore I didn't talk about it. But I had to talk about it. And my son at the age of 14, 15, asked me this question because I owned it to him. And what I told him approximately, as many facts came afterwards, I'm speaking now about my life for almost 20 years, 15 years. What I told him approximately what I'm going to tell you. Again, I was born in this beautiful, gorgeous city in which I'm not advocating for the German tourism industry, but it's a beautiful city, a 1,000-year-old city, untouched by any wars, modeled after Rome, with the cathedral in the center of the hill, in the center of the town, built on a hill around churches that crowned each hill, 7 hills within the city, a bastion of Catholicism, actually the only place where the Pope was buried outside Rome. So we were raised as children to appreciate history, untouched history dating back to 1,000 years. But I noticed that there was something not kosher, not that I used the term. When I was 7, 8 years old, a little munchkin in elementary school, we walked to the city. We were supposed to identify places, churches, kings, names, writing a history. I noticed there's something missing. There's something unique, because there was something that happened in a recent history that was a war. And I knew in the war people win and people lose. And when American soldiers, 10,000 of them, are stationed in the outskirts of the city of 75,000, we didn't win that war. So that's the only thing I knew. There was this history, black hole, nobody talked about it. And when I asked my parents about that time, the war, and where they're from, they didn't want to answer. For my parents, the standard answer was, we don't talk about it. We're only moving forward. We're not looking back. That's it. But I was always exploring and nudging and asking. That's my typical me at the age of 64. I'm still like that, asking the question why. For example, who is my grandfather? Who are my grandparents? And nobody told me because they were gone in the war. And it was not talked about. It was silence, total silence. Eventually, my father and mother decided to tell me the story of their respective lives. And I heard on the one hand from my father, and on the other hand from my mother, 2 different stories. One of glory from my father's side, and one of horror from my mother's side. My father, when he started talking and telling me his life story, he never stopped him, but like a record, he put the record on and on and on. Every Sunday afternoon when we walked in the forest, he taught me how to handle a rifle, how to shoot, how to fish. I had a very close relationship with him. He told me this story that he was the youngest tank commander, elite tank commander, in a German unit under the command of Guderian, the father of the German Blitzkrieg, General Guderian. And my father was his disciple. And in every war, literally every war that the opened Germany in that time, 1st of September 1939, the invasion of Poland, my father's tanks were the first to roll in, Blitzkrieg, moving forward fast. In the summer of 1940, the attack on Belgium, Holland, and France, my father's tanks were the first to roll in. Then, of course, the fatal attack on the former Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, where my father's tanks again not only rolled in, they rolled to the furthest, close to the edges of Moscow, and conquered a strategically located city called Orel. And for that accomplishment, he was awarded the Knight's Cross by a man whom he still adoringly referred to as his Führer, Adolf Hitler. Now, you have to take in consideration, I was 8 years old. I never heard the term Führer. I never heard the term Hitler. I just knew my father was a war hero. And the message that he was a war hero was reinforced by his old war buddies who came to visit our house at least once a year to celebrate the good old times, celebrate the times of the war, singing songs about the war, the Horst Wessel League. I mean, this was hardcore Nazis. And I remember one of them who looked at me and said, "Look, Bernd, your father's a hero. Everybody admires him. You should be proud of him." So my father, with a Knight's Cross around his neck, for me was the hero. On the other hand, my mother told me a completely different story, though. She was an ethnic German, born and raised in Czechoslovakia, where for the last 300, 400 years, ethnic Germans settled on the border region between Czechoslovakia and Germany. And beautiful villa. My grandfather, my maternal grandfather, was a wealthy merchant. He could afford to build a beautiful villa, could afford to have all the trappings of the lifestyle. My mother was the only child. The San Bernard told me these stories about the San Bernard. The San Bernard was sitting here, about the parrot that she had. Everything lost. Just rescued a picture of a house with a gun in her hand that my father gave her, and she fled in 1945 towards the border. My grandparents, maternal grandparents, died as a result of this horrendous flight. Thousands and hundred thousands of Russians in pursuit of Germans to kill them. And my mother survived. So glory and horror. But there was something else that bothered, that vexed me, because it was staring me in my eyes every morning. There was, in our house, we lived in a massive 2-story building, patrician-style building in Bamberg. It's still standing there, so renovated, but the impressiveness of this building you can still fathom when you go there. And when we were in the ground floor, and in the upper floor, in the second floor, was a lady living that my mother asked me to refer to her as the Countess, Gräfin in German, the Countess. Never talking to her unless spoken to, not because she didn't like her, but it was normal not to be talking directly to a noble person. I didn't know what that meant, but that's what my mother wanted me to do. And in the hallway, right next to the stairway that leading upstairs to the Countess's apartment, was a larger-than-life portrait of a man mounting at the wall in uniform, like my father, whose pictures I saw at home, the Knight's Cross around his neck, the officer's insignia on the shoulder, he was a colonel, and the officer's cap on his head. And when I asked my father who this man was, my father looked at me and said, "Do not ask me this question anymore. He was a traitor, ein Verräter." And I asked myself, how can it be? A man who looked like my father, at least in the picture, and my father looked like him, at least in the photographs that I had. How can two men who looked alike be bad and one can be good? Simple question of a child. Until I found out that the man who was depicted on this painting was no other than a painting of Klaus Count von Stauffenberg, the German colonel who was leading the assassination attempt on Adolf Hitler on the 20th of July, 1944, which unfortunately failed. He was executed the same night. And his widow, Nina von Stauffenberg, the Countess, lived upstairs. Now, I never made the connection because I was young, 9 years, but there was something unique that my father didn't like him, and I shouldn't talk to her. There's something weird going on, to simplify it. And every my Sunday, when my parents, we had lunch, and then everybody went schluffen for 2 or 3 hours, and I never went to sleep. I wanted to explore. And I heard the Countess's grandchildren sneaking up there, playing, and I sneaked up there too. And I entered an apartment. There were several times in this apartment. The last time I was about 22. And the walls were covered wall to wall, no space left, with pictures of that man smiling and laughing, anti-context. Pictures of beauty, pictures of tranquility, pictures of happiness. And I asked myself, not in the intellectual depth in spirit yet, how can it be that my father doesn't like it? Very simple. And I was about 12, 13, we started to talk in school about that time that we normally never talked about, the time between 1933 and 1945. There was an approach. And what we learned in school, I mean, not in every school, but in our school at least, that Adolf Hitler rose to power on January 30th, 1933. He was appointed by the then President Hindenburg, Marshal Hindenburg, and the Prime Minister Papen. And within 3 months, he turned Germany from a fledgling democracy, the Weimar Republic, to a dictatorship. In March of 1933, the first concentration camp was opened. There was Dachau, not for Jews, but for those who were not wanting to live or criticize the country, i.e. socialists, communists, homosexuals, and so on. Everybody was a deviant.
So
In the
until
same
this
month,
point, sorry, until this point, the Jews were not mentioned in your school. It was just
no, not the only mentioning of Jews was the following: Jews killed Jesus. That we would learn in Sunday school from a priest. Now, I had no reference, not that I'm innocent, but I had no reference to Jews because I just listened to what the pastor said.
So sorry, just one more thing
No, go ahead.
about Hitler. Was he kind of painted in a neutral light?
Yes. He was painted as it evolved, first in a neutral light, that he was the elected chancellor, and he was the elected and then appointed chancellor of Germany. March of 1933, the Reichstag, the parliament, was burning, most likely a ruse developed conducted by Hitler and his con man, in order to show people we need to have a stronger government because look what happened. And Germany, as our teachers told us, was responsible for the Second World War, started in 1939, 50 million, 100 million people died, mostly Russians and others. And also there were 6 million Jews, collateral damage of war. Nothing mentioned specifically, nothing about the Holocaust. It was put in the part of losses. And then on the 8th of May, 1945, Germany surrendered. Hitler committed suicide in April, 2 weeks before. And Hoff and Puff, the Nazis, disappeared like a bunch of Huns, invading Germany and then disappeared, the barbarians. Well, that was, of course, horse manure. That was not the true story. And the true story came up because of a necessity. The necessity to deal with history and the necessity to deal with an event in recent history that changed the entire equation, and it changed my life. The Olympics in Germany, Munich, 1972. That was the first time that Germany, as West Germany, could shine, and as not only as a state on the border of the Cold War, but also defending democracy, rebuilding a country that is worthwhile to be called a democratic republic. And at that time, in 1969 specifically, a politician was elected to be the Chancellor of Germany, who was a complete break with the past, because he was not a Nazi, he was a socialist, Willy Brandt, and he escaped Germany in 1933, escaped to Norway with the occupation of Norway, escaped to Sweden, returned to Germany to reclaim his citizenship, and built a party to now called Social Democratic Party, to a powerhouse that rose to power in 1969. And he was the first German politician, untinged, not tarnished by the crimes of the Nazis, who traveled to Poland in a December day, 1970, and in front of the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial, he sank on his knees, bowed his head, and asked for forgiveness, what Germany did. That was an unheard event. I know because it was unheard, because on the front page of our newspaper, the picture of the Chancellor kneeling in front of the memorial. And my father read newspaper every morning. He wanted me to read and understand the world. He asked me a question. But that morning, he slammed the newspaper on the breakfast table, pointing on the Chancellor kneeling in, and said, "Schau mal her, Bernd, wieder ein Verräter." look, Bernd, again a traitor. And I was confused. I said, how can it be that my father reacts so cholerically, so crazy? Because if somebody kneels in front of a memorial, like I kneeled in front of in church, for something positive, something very moral and very moral man and ethical man. Why my father is so mad? And this chancellor, with a tremendous moral standing in the Western world, opened Germany to the Olympics in 1972. And in August 1972, the Olympics in Munich started. And this was not only for those who were connoisseurs of Olympic Games, but for Germany, extremely important to demonstrate to the world that they're different. And my parents invited for the opening ceremony friends over. I had to call most of our friends as uncle and aunt, even though I knew that they were not my uncle and aunt, because I didn't have a family, or at least my father didn't want to tell me that there's a family. And they were coming, and it was fine food, wine, beer, and of course our first TV black and white bill. And all the teams parading to the stadium and carrying their respective flags, hooray, hello, clapping. And then suddenly a team paraded into the stadium carrying a flag with a star inside, the Israeli team. And in that moment, ice cold. Nobody talked. Everybody looked away, as if a ghost appeared on the screen. It didn't happen. And I knew it was the do not ask the question moment. And I asked myself, that's weird. That's just another team. Again, a child trying to make a connection. Unfortunately, 10 days later, the same team that's proudly paraded into the stadium was brutally attacked by a group of Palestinian terrorists from the Popular Front of the Liberation of Palestine, supported by the PLO, and supported, we know that now, by the East German Secret Service, Stasi, Staatssicherheitsdienst, call it the Mossad of East Germany. And the terrorists were equipped with everything that they needed, most likely through East Berlin. And they climbed the fence to attack the Israelis in the Olympic Village. 2 were butchered, brutally butchered, and the remainder were taken hostage and all were beaten to death. And the Olympics came to a halt on behest of the German government. The German government wanted to know that they had to stop the Olympics. They had no jurisdiction, but they begged the Olympic Committee to stop the Olympics, which was done after 1 day. And personally, the Minister of Interior and the Foreign Minister negotiated face-to-face with Carlos, the terrorist leader, asking Issa, the terrorist leader, asked him and begged him to release the hostages in lieu of cabinet members of the German government. Issa denied that. He wanted to be flown out by helicopter from the Olympic Village to an outside military airport. The Germans should provide a Boeing 747 of the German Air Force to be flown out to an Arab country of their choice. And then Israel should release 260 to 280 prisoners in a big fanfare, most likely taking place in Cairo or in Libya, to release them and demonstrate that that the terrorists have won. Well, I remember every beat, every second, every minute of what happened then. Helicopters landed behind the closed gates of the Olympic Village. We could only see on the cameras, we could only see that 2 groups were disseminated and separated in 2 helicopters. The helicopters flew towards the military airport, followed by a 3rd helicopter of the German army, who actually had wanted to shoot it down in case something goes wrong, and landed behind the closed gates of the military airport of Fürstenfeldbruck, not far away from Dachau. And then all hell broke loose. Firefight, night sky lit by explosions, and for about 2 hours, and then deafening silence. What happened was literally put together in one sentence by an American journalist who turned towards the camera and looked in the camera and said, they're all gone. What happened that the Arab terrorists, when they felt surrounded and wanted to board the flight, the 707, it was empty. There were no pilots, there was no nothing. They knew it's a trap, and they started to fire the German police, which had only rifles, like toy rifles, we call them. The Mossad, head of the Mossad, Zvi Samir, was on the ground with Mossad teams begging the Germans, do not open fire. These are skilled terrorists. These are skilled operators. These are soldiers of fortune. So let us do it. The Germans didn't want to do it. And what happened? When Issa found himself surrounded through a hand grenade in one helicopter, which exploded, all the Israelis alive burned in a fireball. And the other helicopter is sprayed with machine gun fire, and everybody died. And the next morning a picture in a newspaper all over Germany, front page, including the ones that my father read. A picture of 2 helicopters on the tarmac, one burned out with the charred remains of the Israeli inside, the other with the body of the Israelis slumped over the seat, barely covered with white linen. And a big headline, Jews killed in Germany again. Now, I speak German pretty fluently. I also spoke it pretty fluently then. What do I mean again? Murdered? Doesn't make any sense. What do I mean? This was an accident. And I asked my father what happened. And my father was livid. Schau mal her, was die wir uns antun. Look what they, the Jews, do to us. Whenever they are here, they're causing trouble, and we have to deal with the trouble. The victims as the perpetrators, and the perpetrators as the victims. And in school, after this horrendous event, our teachers felt compelled to talk for an entire week about this. Some of them cried. Some of them couldn't finish their sentences. Of course, they told us from the bottom of the heart what happened during the Second World War. What happened to the Jews? There was no collateral damage. It was murder.
So I'm curious actually regarding the children. These are presumably, these teachers also are children of Nazis, a lot of them, and some and you know, when you lose a war, it's not like people just automatically change their minds, but they just have to kind of, you know, move on with life, but all of their true inner feelings remain, most likely, unless they kind of snap out of it. But I'm always curious, you know, in this story, because you're telling me that you know, the German version of Mossad was behind helping them. There's still this sense of hatred towards Jews in Germany that remains.
No, actually not. It was I think the most horrendous event that happened in Munich was interpreted by the Germans and was seen by the Germans as being powerless over what happened around the majority. My father belonged to those who were just could not put this A and B together. My father was unrepentant. He didn't want it to change, but he was forced to talk about it. And the way he talked about this is to denigrate the victims. And that was, I couldn't understand it. Why is in this horrendous event that affected our entire nation, everybody was demonstrating on the street, where people denouncing the events of Munich. And my father didn't want to talk about it. And I asked myself, if my father not talk about it, something else happened that he didn't want to tell me. And I started to read everything I could get my hands on, in French, in German, in Hebrew, in Spanish, in languages that I could understand, at least basic. I read every book that I could find. And the more I read, I had the sinking feeling that the reason that my father didn't talk about that time, and that the reason that his deeds were glorified, is that he has to hide something. And I needed to know, because I admired my father. I loved my father. He was a man who wanted to guide me in life, who helped me to achieve and to learn and to think logically. My father cannot be that one of those. And I asked him questions, which of course he wouldn't answer. So I had to find the right moment and the right time in the following years to get the information out of him. And my father was a raging alcoholic. And as a child of a raging alcoholic, you know that there's this twilight zone moment when he's not drunk yet, or when he's too drunk, in this twilight zone, I call it the Schicker zone, where you could literally manipulate him and get money out of him. And that was the manipulative behavior that I learned as a child of an alcoholic, without knowing the logic behind, but I succeeded. And I asked him questions over the course of time that started out with phase 1, I call it. Father, in school we learned about the Holocaust. What can you tell me about it? Holocaust? It's a lie. Von den Juden erfunden, die internationalen Juden, international Jews, the Jews that are cosmopolitans and manipulating the power all over the world. We didn't do anything. This has never happened. And if something happened, it was not us, the Wehrmacht. It was all the SS. Well, that was a lie. I knew that really at that time, but 20 years after his death, I found the truth just to verify that it was a big lie. Found a picture. When the archives opened up after the fall of the wall and the end of the Cold War, a military historian were contacted by mail. There was no internet yet. He guided me in finding material about my father, and he found it. I got a picture of my father sitting next to Heinrich Himmler. Heinrich Himmler was the head of the SS. My father was a major in the tank forces. When Wehrmacht officers and the head of the SS men was never about tank tactics. It was about securing kill zones. The Wehrmacht surrounded kill zones. Then I found a letter was found on my behest, which is very difficult still nowadays to think about it. It was a letter signed by my father, a transfer of about 600 or 700 Russian prisoners of war to a place in Poland called Auschwitz for neutralization. Means I will not take away the suffering of Jews from Auschwitz, but many 100,000 were not Jews, including Russians who were worked to death or gassed, Russian prisoners of war. So my father lied to me through and through. He was dead already, but I knew this lie was born in that day. Then the second phase of questions and answers was, Father, how can it be that so many children were killed by people like you? He looked at me and said, very serious. He said, no, we did kill them. They were responsible for their death because there's something called the Geneva Convention. If you are a combatant with a gun in your hand, you can be killed. We don't have the rules of war don't apply. I asked him rhetorically, you tell me that 1.2 million children lined up in front of the horror, the burning, the gas chambers and the burning of the bodies, and saw that, and everybody knew what happened, and the ashes rained down like snow on people that lived near Auschwitz. How can you justify the killing of 1.2 million children, which had absolutely nothing to do with you, the mightiest army in the world? He stopped talking. And then one day he was drunk, but he had the intention. It was a conflict over and over. It was a friction. My mother cried always, and we were yelling at each other. She was in between. But it was the last question that I asked him. And I said, can you tell me something about the Holocaust that you lied through? I know what it was. And I said, the Holocaust never happened, and it's the fault of the Jews. We never did anything to them. They messed it all up. And by the way, the world should be grateful for what we did, because we got rid of the Lichluch, the schmutz, the drag, the dirt, the litter. The world should give us a price that we dealt with the Jews once and for all. They didn't let us finish it. But that was the point where the straw broke the camel's back. I turned away from my father. I did not want to have any interest in communicating anymore. I was obsessed with the burning desire to know why the Jews? Who are the Jews? Because I never met a Jew. I mean, again, my mother was an Orthodox Catholic, sent me to Catholic kindergarten, Catholic school, elementary school. I was an altar boy. She wanted me to become a priest. Obviously, that didn't work out. Didn't become one. But how can it be that Jews were selected to be different, to be killed just because we're different? And I asked one of my teachers, a former Jesuit priest, who was a teacher in ethic and religion. His name was Jupp, actually a very common name, like Smith. And he said, Bernd, my parents never answered the question because my father didn't return from the war. What I learned, you need to make amends to those that were harmed or killed. I said, how can I make amends? I don't know Jews. I said, well, the Catholic Church organizing once a year a trip of Israelis, Jews and Arabs alike, to Germany, from Neve Shalom, a peace initiative in Israel. And they're learning from each other. And we always invite a German participant to that too. And I was a German participant. And for the first time in the age of 19, 18, I met Jews. I mean, it was a big deal. Well, I didn't imagine that in hook nose and were dressed in a black shtreimel and a black hat. But people like you and me, sure, we were the same generation. You exchange information, who music you like, whose band you like, what food you like, and I like the Israeli girls a lot. I have to clearly say that I was not only driven by spiritual needs, but one of these Israeli girls told me, look, Tacheles, if you like me, you come to visit me, right? I mean, that Israeli girls are straightforward. Yeah. And come right to the point. And I said, of course I will do that. But it was just one minor problem. I neither had a passport, nor did I have money. And when she left, I was heartbroken. And within 2 months, I got my passport together, worked in the summer, got some money. And I traveled in a very adventurous way to Israel, which I do not recommend anybody to do it, unless you have time to spare in licking your wounds. I hitchhiked to Munich. From Munich, I took a train across the Alps to Ancona. It's a port city in Italy. From there by ferry to Piraeus. It was not a cruise ship. We were sleeping on deck. and periodically reprovisioned. I sent a telex to her. That was before Google Schmoogle and all that stuff. And I sent a telex to her that I would arrive in Latin that day in Haifa. And I remember the first time I ever arrived in Israel. I did this trip again years later. The mountains, the Carmel Mountains, almost the closer we came to the coast, almost emerged from this ocean, from the Mediterranean Sea. A beautiful morning. Pious Jews were standing on top of the boat, laying tefillin and praying. And it was a mystic moment. I said, this is something unique. And I had immediately was overcome by the feeling and the question, what if somebody finds out that my name is Wollschlaeger and my father did something to that family? I mean, it was a justifiable fear. But I then saw her at the customs area, and all doubts and fear was wiped away. She embraced me, said, let's go to my parents. We went with a community taxi up to the hill, the area called Neve Sha'anan, which was a working class settlement at that time. And her parents were waiting outside, this tiny little house. They were waiting outside the house, welcoming me like the long lost son. Her father took my bag, my rucksack, my mother took the bag, walked into the house and chit-chatting with me. I had no idea what they were talking about because it was Yiddish. Sitting me down, they opened one room for them, and they all lived in another room. It was a 2-room house, not 2 bedrooms, 2-room house, very tiny, working class environment. And they dished out for dinner everything that I probably never ate. We were true hummus falafel trainer, and chit-chatting and trying to communicate with me. And I didn't understand. And then her father turned to me, looked me in my eyes. He was a pretty strong man, a foreman in the port of Haifa. He looked at me and said, I can speak German. I really don't want to anymore, but can you understand me better if I would speak to you in German? I said, sure. How did you learn German? Naive that I was. He looked me in my eyes and pointed a number tattooed on his forearm and said, ich war in den Lagern. Not in a camp, in camps, plural. I was in the, ich war in den Lagern, I was in the camps. And I survived with the death march from Auschwitz. I survived. I stayed 2 to 3 years in Germany in a displaced person camp. And I had to learn that not all Germans are monsters, even after the war. And he immigrated to Israel, married and founded a family. But he looked at me and said, do they teach you everything what you need to know? And I was sitting there for the first time in a Jewish family, in the house of a Holocaust survivor in Israel, wanted to sink in the ground, disappear. So don't be afraid. I just wanted to make you understand what really happened. And a few days later, he took off from work and traveled with me to Yad Vashem. It was a Holocaust memorial in Yerushalayim. And he took me by his hand and walked slowly to the old exhibit at that time, slowly, and pointed out every single piece of the exhibit. When we finished, about an hour and a half later, I broke down. I could not understand how these people, in a positive sense, who rebuild their life, rebuild their families, rebuild an old nation anew, how can they not hate? I'm a representative of the people that killed them. My father was such a murderer. How can they not hate me? There must be something unique, something different. And I wanted to know what. And when I returned to Germany, I decided to approach a Jewish community and learn more about them. And the problem was, in Germany, I had a population of 60 to 70 million in West Germany at that time. There were only about 25,000, optimistically guessed, 25,000 Jews left. And they were hermetically sealed off, literally, in communities like in Berlin, Munich, and Frankfurt. Bamberg was kind of an off, because there were only about 60 to 80 Jews left. And I found a Jewish community in Bamberg, seeking it out. The entrance was the building was in the center of Bamberg, but the entrance was to the courtyard. And there was a sign, engraved sign on copper plate, in written Israelitische Kultusgemeinde, not even Jewish community, Israelite cultural community. And I knocked at the door several times. An old man, definitely only about 5'4", looked at me, opened the door reluctantly, and looked at me. Was willst du? What do you want? And I must have chatted or bubbled or whatever. He felt comfortable to let me in because he thought it's an interesting young man. Let him in. And we walked to this dark corridor with a light in the corner, red light, and the walls covered literally inch by inch with plates of names engraved on each plate. I said, what is that? I said, this is the Ner Tamid, the eternal light. And this here are the names of all those Bamberg Jews who never returned from Theresienstadt Auschwitz, Stutthof, Treblinka, Majdanek. About 1,200. That was my beginning of understanding what horrendous things happened. He showed me the community. It was like a Stibelech, a Habima. It was a little, definitely for a minion had to squeeze in. And he went to his office. It was a summer day, very hot, curtain closed, windows closed, no air condition, no fan. And he had this, he was very pale and had a short-sleeved white shirt on and the number tattooed on his forearm. And I looked, I stared. Even today, I have a tough time to take my eyes open and see something like that. He looked at me and said, first of all, my name is Itzhak Rosenberg. I'm the chair of the Jewish community. What's left? Das ist Auschwitz. What do you want? Tough as nails. I said, I want to learn. I said, well, take a few books and learn. You're German, you bring it back. So I read all the books that could be read, but I want to know how I can help. What do you mean help? I want to learn how I can help you. I said, young man, you're unusual, but there's never a free lunch. If you want me to teach you about Judaism, which you just expressed, and you think it's free, come again. You have to be our Shabbos goy, and I will tell you what to do. Shabbos goy, I had no idea what a Shabbos goy meant, but it was a good ticket into the community. He would teach me for free, and I would be a Shabbos shmabbos. I had no idea. And he showed me how to make, what a Shabbos goy is, show me a Shabbat, to make coffee, food, had to warm up. And then he told me, look, when you are here in the community as a Shabbos goy, you better squeeze yourself in the corner, because the alte kackers, that's what he said, the alte kackers will not like you. And they were right. When he came in, I have learned that. So he said, when shall I come? I said, Friday at 6 o'clock. I was there at 6 o'clock. He came at 8. He looked at me, was machst du? He told me at 6 o'clock. 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock. It's the German, Deutschen musst du den Kopf verändern. You have to think differently, reprogram. And so I learned that they don't take it to exactly. And showed me what to do and said, wait in the corner, don't say anything. And indeed, every member of the community that came was macht der Goy dort? And I said, do what you have to do. You help me. So I come every Friday, every Saturday, week by week, month to month, year by year, holiday by holiday, for 5 years. Showed up in the community without break. And the more I came close to the community of choice, the more I separate myself from the community of origin, my family. There were several blow-ups that would take too much of your time, but one blow-up that really blew everything up was when Christmas fell on a Friday night. And for my mother, as an Orthodox Catholic, I could literally write the script, what happened. At that time, we were going to, in the evening, going to the mosque, to the cathedral. After the Christmas Mass, we came back, ate traditional food, lentil soup and carp. Then we were waiting for my father ringing the bell so my mother could open these big oak doors that lead into this huge living room that we had. My father standing next to the Christmas tree with real candles, with his finest dark suit and the knight's cross around his neck, singing festive Christmas hymns. Now, I was not there. I came on Saturday after Shabbos, so Saturday evening, after sunset. And my father was yelling, my mother was crying. He said, look what you did to her mother. Why didn't you show up? I said, tell you one thing. Let's get this Greek tragedy out of the way. I will not sit with you on the same table with blood on your hand and this damned cross around your neck that you think is something that you earned. There's blood on that blood stain. You were a murderer like all the other murderers. I hate you. That was an emotional outburst. My father looked at me, raus, get out. It was a tiny little problem, kesef, no money. Well, even though I was in the second to last year of medical school, I had a scholarship, I could make it, but there was some extra expense that I didn't know how to work for, so I had to start working. And I never asked from the community for money, nor did I get for money. And Itzhak must have noticed something. He was like my substitute father. He must have noticed something and didn't want to tell him what happened. And he must have told people, because suddenly, after 5 years of my task in the community, a man approached me. His name was Aaron, who never talked to me. And Aaron looked at me, was like 5'2", 5'3", and looked at me and said, du bist der Goy. Yes, Aaron. And du bist, deine Schuhe und deine Jacke sind schmutzig. Your shoes and the jacket are dirty. Kauf dir neue Sachen, buy new stuff and give me 100 mark. So first he insulted me, then he gave me 100 mark. I went to Itzhak on Saturday afternoon, we were in Menucha, went into his office and said, look, Aaron just gave me 100 mark. Aaron gave me 100 mark. This stingy guy gave me 100 mark. Didn't you ask for 200? Why should I ask for 200? Well, because that's what you do among Jews. You go up. And I was looking confused. I said, he had this sick humor, but wonderful humor. And he looked at me and said, look, sit down, Bernd. Let me explain you something. We are not normal people. Not because God chose us to be not normal, but because he suffered so much. I barely got my life together, married a non-Jewish woman, and she converted, and we had a beautiful family. No children, but a beautiful family. She helped me to reconstruct his emotional jacket, he called it. Aaron, I just found out from the Red Cross that he was in Auschwitz. Nothing else. Validated he was in Auschwitz. Whole family disappeared. He was the only survivor. Now was another thing to the story, because Aaron started to talk with me every Friday, every Saturday, sensing that he was probably getting old and will die without telling the truth. I was a member of the Sonderkommando in Auschwitz. I don't know if you know what it is. I spare you the details. Sonderkommando was a group of Jews who guided other Jews through their doors or entrance of the chamber, gave them a number, a plastic card with a number, said, take your clothes off, this is the number that you remember, that's yours, and keep the number in your other number in the hand to identify it. Then they closed the door, and the Nazis and the murderers opened the vent and threw Cyclone B in there. And he told me it didn't end after 2 minutes. Sometimes it were 10, 15 minutes. Some even survived, but died. And they had the Sonderkommando to open the doors with the gas mask on, pull out the bodies, took the gold teeth out, burned the bodies, crushed the bones, and scattered on the killing field of Auschwitz, Treblinka, Splutov. And he cried. And actually, the story that he told me, I know now why he told me the story, because he knew he was dying. He had cancer. And I got a call about 6 or 7 months later in the university that immediately should call back, because there was no cell phone. I left a message, called back Itzhak, and said, Itzhak, what happened? No, you never know, don't call. Come here, Bernd, Aaron died. Come back home. It was about 1 hour train ride. I went back home for me, the community. So we have to, Orthodox community, as you know, we have to bury it. Aaron, we have to clean his body tonight, then we have to bury him tomorrow morning. And we did that in the nighttime. He said, you're a medical student, you know how to clean, you have no problem with the body. I said, yeah. And in the morning, we had to bury him in the casket. It was according to German law. In an open casket, I said goodbye, and then Aaron and Itzhak came to me and gave me a book. He said, you say the Kaddish. I knew the Kaddish by heart. I said, I cannot say the Kaddish. I mean, I'm not a Jew. He said, you're one of us, and you were his friend. And I said the Kaddish. And that was crossing the line. I mean, I crossed the line. Emotionally, spiritually, I crossed the line. I said, and a few days later, I said to Itzhak, I want to convert. I don't, that's my home. That's my family. Itzhak looked at me. I showed you that. You looked at it. This is Auschwitz. We only suffer, Jews. We have nothing good in the world to expect. Be a righteous man. You're Gerd Tzedek. You don't have to become a Jew. But I want to become a Jew. I said, well, I feared that this moment would come. I put some money aside to travel to Frankfurt to the rabbi there. And you don't come back. You pay for the hotel, the food, and everything in the train. But don't come back until the rabbi cleared up your head. Well, rabbi tried to clear up my head. And then he said, I will never convert you, but we have lessons together and you learn about Judaism. So I did that for 2 years. And every time I finished the lesson, I said, I want to become a Jew. Until he gave up in about March 1986. I said, Bernd, I refer your case to the rabbinical court. I'm one member of the rabbinical court. I don't guarantee that your case will be successfully dealt with. But you have to do, unfortunately, 2 steps already before, in anticipation that you might get converted. One is a little plastic surgery. I don't want to talk about it. The only mohel that you can save was in Basel. And I traveled to Basel. There was a mohel in Munich, but he was a drunk. So with the shaky hands, you don't take that risk. And true story. And then 4 months later, I had to travel to Metz in France to immerse myself in an Orthodox mikveh by a Haredi community. I went back to the Mismachim, with the papers together. I went back to Germany and prepared myself for the hearing, which was in December 1986. And I remember it was like a court hearing. The Shoftim was sitting on an elevated stage. I was sitting in a chair looking up to them. They had dark coats on. the head of the shofet, and the chief rabbi looked at my papers and said, "Look, you have a stellar career. You know everything. A lot of character witnesses, but that all means nothing to me. I want to know why a German, the son of a Nazi, wants to become a Jew. Tell me your story." And I told him the story. And they retreated for a dion, for a session. Came back, I had to stand up. I was very intimidating. And the chief rabbi wrote up the Gio, first read in Hebrew, then in German. Said, "Do you understand what that means?" Before we closed the session. "Yeah, you're a Jew now. But do you thought about your name? Your name is Ben Abraham. You cannot change it. But your first name?" I said, "No. Well, your first name is what? Bernd. Do you know what Bernd means? The bear slayer. Dubi. From now on, your name is Dov Ben Abraham." And I was overwhelmed. It was an overwhelming feeling. And I immediately applied for the Jewish agency for immigration. I got the Israeli embassy in Bonn. I got the immigrant visa. And according to the law of return, chok hashut. And 1 month later, I took a one-way ticket from Frankfurt to Tel Aviv to disappear in Israel, literally. I didn't want to say goodbye to my parents until Aaron, Itzhak, who said, "Look, it was the one that I had to say goodbye." Of course, everybody in the community, and Itzhak was sad. I said, you have to get your own happy life together. Maybe we see each other again. Didn't. And, "But did you say goodbye to your parents?" I said, "No, I will not." I said, "How can you be a Jew and not honor your parents?" I said, "How can I honor my parents? There's only one parent in the world. You have to say goodbye. Honor them." My father didn't want to see me. My mother was crying, and I left. I came to a kibbutz, learned Hebrew, picked bananas. If you want to know anything about bananas, we can put an edit to that. Then I was 1 year in the hospital to get my German license up to Israeli par. Then I was drafted immediately to the Israeli army because I waived the waiting period and served in the Israeli army in the occupied territories. And I remember one of the first days, I was a lieutenant. I was inspiring lieutenant and doctor. And my commanding officer was in Beit El the first month of the first Intifada in October 1988, Arab uprising, full battle gear. My commanding officer said, "Look, Hebra, this is your doctor. His name is change it, Dr. BW. And when there's a problem, he's taking care of it. If I get killed, he's a commanding officer." Well, that was nice. And I asked myself, if they find out that I'm a Nazi son in drag, they kick me out of here. I mean, they at best, at worst, they throw me in the Arab village, they kill me. So I decided to throw my past in this virtual closet, slammed the door shut, took the key, locked the lock, and tried to throw away the key. That was a big mistake, because I didn't want to talk ever about my past until my son Tal asked me a simple question. "Father, who is my grandfather?" And I told him the story. I had to tell him the story. I couldn't lie anymore. I couldn't conceal anymore. And my son said, "That's a cool story. Can I tell my friends in school?" I said, "No." Hillel here in Miami, you don't say that. But my luck that 3 or 4 weeks later, they did a family history day. I was not there, but I was told over and over again from teachers, even last year, what happened. My son, when everybody talked about the family history, going back to the house of David or Solomon, my son raised his right hand and proudly declared that my grandfather was a famous Nazi. Now, it doesn't fly well in a Jewish school. You have to go to the principal's office. And the principal was very upset, together with the rabbi who was quiet. So, "Dr. Wollschlaeger, you're a respected member of our community. Your son Tal told us verdrehte Geschichte that your father was a Nazi. What is wrong with him? Is he on drugs?" "No, he's not on drugs." I told him my life story. And the rabbi looked at me. He did what? "Life story. Come with me." He took me by hand and said, "Can you tell it to other people?" I said, "I can't." "Tell it now, here, in front of my class, your son's class." And here I spoke for the first time about my life. And when I finished, I had this weight lifted off my shoulders. And I asked myself, why didn't I go back? I need to go back and close this circle of life that opened so many years ago. And I took my son in December 2004 back to Germany, to Bamberg, visited my parents, and the only place I knew I could visit them is a cemetery. They were long dead. And it sounds incredibly made up of the Hollywood movie story, but it's true. If you go to Bamberg, there's the central Friedhof cemetery is divided into a Jewish and a Christian part. literally in one area, just divided by a wall. In my parents' graveyard is exactly two walls parallel, located two walls parallel to the wall that separates the Jewish from the Christian cemetery. You could see on the other side from my parents, you still can, from my parents' side, the Jewish gravestones mounting above the mountain, almost defiantly casting the shadow to the other side. Here I was standing with my son and my parents' graveside and said, I don't know what to tell you. I was choking up. I don't know what to tell you, but I stepped out of the shadow because I had to learn the truth. I had to take responsibility. But my parents never did. And look, even in death, they're in the shadow of history. And the reason that I'm telling this story is not to show myself as the hero. I'm not. I'm just followed the path that I had to go. But is making people aware sharing with people what I learned from my father. Because my father taught me something very important, that words have consequences. If you don't challenge the words that come out of a person's mouth, words of hatred, misogyny, Jew hatred, antisemitism, if you don't counter them, these words of hatred fall on the fertile ground, the mind of others, and sprout into deeds. And if these deeds left unchallenged, habits will form. If these habits prevail, characters will form, and these characters will determine social norms that make it okay to kill a Jew. It didn't happen out of the nothing, that from at nihil, suddenly the Jews were killed. It was systematically taking the individuality away, taking the humanity away, and then demonize them as animals. And then you had laws already in this March of 1933 that made it okay to kill a Jew because it's not a really human being. And Jews could convert themselves 6 times over. It was the racial theory that Adolf Hitler pursued, the sick racial theory that made it impossible, even with conversion, to run away from and jump out of the shadow. You were dead. And the reason that I'm talking more over and over again about my life and travel the world, and hopefully not as much as I did in the last 10 years, but still traveled Australia, New Zealand, in Latin America, and Europe, Canada, United States, because it's like disappearing Holocaust victims. The victims of the Holocaust die, as well those of me who will eventually die sooner or later, who were the children of Nazis. And I should be proud, and my children should be proud of what I do, but I'm not, because the more I talk and the more I realize that we are slipping deeper and deeper in this sewer of hatred. And hatred is now normal. Hatred of Jews is now something like going to Kentucky Fried Chicken and order chicken wing. It's okay. And when you hear the words, I'm not taking politics or politicians, non-politician people. We talk about the Jews. What do you mean, the Jews? It's Moshe, it's Abraham, it's Yitzhak, it's Ran, it's Eli. We talking about the Jews? Why don't you individualize them? Why don't you want to learn about them? Why don't you allow us to explain to you that we are not animals and we don't have hooks, noses? But in this country, it's happening. And it's not Arab terrorists. It's the mainstream of white Americans. And it's getting worse. It's getting worse and worse. And just the second poison pill that we have is the internet. Nothing against the internet, but it's one word spreads in milliseconds all over the world. Yeah. All over the world, potentiating, augmenting the message. And the question is, what we don't do? We're sitting back and saying, "Oh boy, look what they're doing again." No, that's not what I learned as an Israeli officer in a combat unit. Life can be snipped out of it in a second. I saw people dying and I couldn't save anymore. But we need to, from passive to aggressive, and not in a violent way, but standing up as Jews and say, "Khalas," in Arabic for enough, must speak. In Hebrew for we should not do that anymore. We need to stand together and fight this anti-Semitism, because not everybody is anti-Semitic.
The issue is that, it's anti-Semitism is baked into